It's our great pleasure to welcome our special guest. His name is Curtis Armstrong, and he's an actor who has appeared in many movies. He's also the foremost expert on the late, great Harry Nilsson. It's with great pleasure that we introduce Curtis Armstrong. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure we welcome our special guest, Mr. Curtis Armstrong. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
My first question, who is Curtis Armstrong?
Oh, boy. Well, that's not very hard. He's an actor of some 36 years standing, and father and a husband, and boy, that's about it.
Well, tell us a little bit about where you were born. What was life like growing up?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, in 1953, and at the time it was. You look back on these things with, I do anyway. I suppose with a bit of affection and nostalgia. It was I had a very good childhood growing up, and my family was based in Detroit, but then my father, who worked for Chrysler Corporation, was transferred to Europe in '63, and so we all went, and I wound up living until 1967. I lived in Geneva, Switzerland, and then came back in '67 to Detroit and was there until I left the academy where I studied acting in the early '70s, and I had co-founded a theater company there in Ann Arbor, actually, towards the end of that time, and then moved in '76 to New York.
And one of your earliest loves was you had a very strong interest in books, Washington Irving and
yes,
the Sherlock Holmes books.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about how you discovered the books and how you took it to the level of wanting to collect them.
Well, it was there were always books in the house, in my parents' house and in my father's parents, my paternal grandparents' house. There were always books. And I think when you're drawn to them, you are drawn to them when you're surrounded by them all the time. And when we went to Switzerland, I always loved books, and my parents always bought me books. In fact, I was reminded about the fact that when I was about 5, still living in suburban Detroit, something happened, and I decided I was running away from home. And I packed a suitcase, and there was nothing in the suitcase but books, no clothes, nothing, just books. And because it was, running away was fine, but I couldn't imagine myself without my books. And, hauled this enormous suitcase filled with books, all the way down the street trying to run away from home. So that was sort of rooted in me from an early age, a love of books. I didn't ultimately run away from home, obviously, but somebody driving by recognized me and picked me up and brought me home again. But then being in Switzerland in the '60s, in the early '60s, there was very little as far as culture to do, pop culture certainly. There was a lot of music, and I got a very early dose of loving, particularly English rock and roll from that period, because it was everywhere. But again, you couldn't go see movies. We were too young to see most movies, except for Disney movies and things. They were very strict about that there. And so books became, along with music, became a refuge. And as far as the collecting of them, I guess that was something that just was part of my DNA. I don't know where it came from exactly. Maybe it had to do with moving around a lot, which seems like counterintuitive, because if you're moving around, you don't acquire things, but I guess it was maybe a desire. I see it in my own daughter, actually. She has a similar thing of when you become involved, interested in something, you tend to dive into it deeply. The collecting then, once I became able to actually buy books and collect them, that became an interest.
You said a second ago about you had a DNA kind of to dive into something, and you're known as a somewhat of an expert on Harry Nilsson. And
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how did you first come to listen to Harry?
Oh gosh, I knew his music from the late '60s, actually, but like a lot of people, had no idea that he was the same person doing all of these different types of music. He was very much a chameleon. With Nilsson, he was coming out with songs then, records then, and I liked all of them, but they all didn't. It didn't sound like it was the same person. It was amazing to me. And then, gradually I figured out by about 1972 or so who he was, and it just started. It's one of those connections that you have that are really kind of impossible to explain logically. It's just a connection. You feel like, not that you know the person, but that you have a sort of an intuitive grasp of who that is. And I became really interested in him and listened to all of his music, and he played on a lot of other albums, and a lot of other people, like the Beatles, for example, who adored him, were fans of his, and that was interesting to me, and I became interested, and so by the '70s I was sort of casually collecting a lot of material about his life, and articles when I could find them and that kind of thing, and then by the time he died in the early '90s, he was, I had this massive archive of information on Harry Nilsson. And then when I was trying to get a documentary together, and I was in touch with RCA in New York, and when they found out who I was, they asked me to co-produce the re-releases of Harry's albums, which I did eventually. Doing liner notes and picking out bonus tracks and that kind of thing. I never met him, apart from a letter that I wrote him, a fan letter in '76, which he answered very generously. Aside from that, there was no actual personal connection between me and Harry Nilsson. It was just a real affinity for his music.
So tell us, how did Harry Nilsson begin in music?
Well, he started as a songwriter, sort of a hack songwriter in Hollywood. He was doing demos for people. He worked with Phil Spector for a while. He worked, basically doing any sort of job, but he was writing. He was actually working in a bank at the time. And he was writing songs which were getting put out there and doing some recording, but totally under the radar. No one was really aware of him at the time. And then he was ultimately brought into RCA and given a recording deal. This is a very short version of it. His album Pandemonium Shadow Show, which was released in 1967, post Pepper, and the Beatles were instantly attracted to it and talked about it a lot in interviews. And then by 1968, the Beatles did their big press conference in New York about the formation of Apple, and they were asked about who their favorite American artist was, and they said Nilsson. And then what their favorite American group was, and they said Nilsson, because he was sort of famous for doing multiple, fantastic multi-octave voice and doing a lot of overdubbing, so he sounded like a group. To a lot of people, he sounded like the Beatles. And that was the beginning of it. And he had an active recording career up until 1978, and after that he did some movie and TV work, and then was in retirement, and been sort of in a kind of retirement until his death.
Do you have a favorite record of Harry's, or an album that you think is more important than the others?
I don't think I have one that's more important than the others. I've got several that I like a lot that are favorites of mine. Aerial Ballet for the early albums is marvelous. I have a real affinity for Son of Schmilsson, which was his second sort of rock and roll album. And I also like Sandman, which is one of the later ones. And I like Nilsson. It's actually pronounced Nilsson, but it was the last American album he did in 1977. I love all of those.
And do you have a favorite song, or could you pick a favorite out of all the ones he's recorded?
Well, I can't do a favorite song. I mean, there are so many that I really like. I can't even pick a favorite album. I have to pick 4 albums.
I'll tell you, the cover that he did of Over the Rainbow, that song's been covered so many times, but I believe that his was the finest.
Well, it's a great one. It really is. And that whole session was kind of an amazing one-off, which he did periodically. He did an album only of Randy Newman songs, which is also brilliant. And, of course, The Point, which a lot of people know. Was a one-off, and then Little Touch of Schmilsson in the Night, which is the one you're thinking of, which he did with Gordon Jenkins, the great arranger, conductor. And yeah, I love those recordings. I really do. But I mean, I'm an unabashed, unapologetic fan of his music, and always have been.
According to a past interview you did, you said that you've approached your love of Harry Nilsson from a faux scholarly perspective. What did you mean by that?
I think it's because my interests are primarily literary, so I tend to look at things from that kind of perspective, and Harry's lyrics, sort of, not lyrics so much exclusively, but Harry's body of work plus his life really lends themselves to that kind of a study. It's almost as if, when I wrote in that letter in 76, it was because I wanted to propose writing a biography of him. The idea at that point of a documentary had never crossed my mind, but I was interested in writing a biography because that's how I tended to see things that interested me. I might love the Sherlock Holmes stories or the Woodhouse books or Irving, but in addition to loving those books, I'm interested in how people analyze those people and their work. And that was sort of the way that I wanted to approach Harry, because that was the way I felt. It's the way I have always approached subjects that interest me. So that was why I was probably saying that. I don't remember saying that, but that's probably what I meant, was a subject that interests me, I wind up delving into very deeply. And that's why I said earlier that I see the same thing in my daughter now, and of course she has the internet, which I did not have. So now there's a ton of stuff about Nilsson on the internet, which wasn't there 10 years ago. And so my daughter, when she gets interested in a band, she's got hours worth of, stuff that she can find, and that's what she winds up doing. She's exactly the same as me in that regard. She goes from one band to another because of connections. And I guess that's the thing with Nilsson for me, is I always found interesting connections between Nilsson, other types of music, other musicians, session players, that whole thing, and that interested me.
Yeah, that's very similar to the way I approach subjects, and it is very fascinating to see all the connections in music.
Oh yeah, it goes on and on.
Absolutely. So tell me, how many concerts of Harry Nilsson did you attend?
None, because there were none.
No?
He never performed live.
Really? I did not know that.
Yep.
Interesting.
That was, another thing about him, which was sort of interesting for some people, was the idea that he was somebody who produced all of these albums. But that's why I say post-Pepper, when it comes to the first album, the idea that the Beatles had, which was, we don't have to necessarily perform live anymore. We'll use the studio as an instrument and explore the studio indefinitely. That kind of thing, which is, it's ideal and not really practical at all in the long run. That was sort of the way Harry was. His was born out of I think, a pretty deep, unexpressed stage fright that kept him from performing live, except for one time. The only time that I'm aware of that he performed live in front of an audience was in Las Vegas. In 1992, he made a guest appearance with Ringo Starr and the All-Star Band at Caesar's Palace. They were on tour, the All-Stars were. And he came on unannounced and sang Without You, the big Badfinger hit that he had, his biggest selling, I guess, hit. They had worked it up as a surprise. And to my knowledge, except for, just parties and things like that. That is the only time he ever performed live in front of an audience. He did a lot of TV performances, but only in situations where he could control what was going on, which meant it had to be taped ahead of time.
Very interesting. So tell us, is there anything on the horizons with you, Curtis?
Well, yeah, I'm working at various things all the time, yeah. I just finished a movie in Louisiana called Flypaper with Patrick Dempsey and Tim Blake Nelson, Ashley Judd, and Jeffrey Tambor. That's only just finished. There are a couple of movies that are coming out. One is called High School, which comes out next month, I think, and that's Michael Chiklis and Adrian Brody are in that. And I'm doing a regular gig on American Dad as a voice, as well as two other animated series which are not on yet, won't be on until next year, but we've been recording them all summer. So, there are odds and ends, different things. Just the usual stuff.
This may be a hard question to answer, but of all of the movies and all of the television shows that you've appeared in, is there one that is more meaningful to you?
No. I can say honestly, no. Meaningful. It's a job, there are movies that I like more than others. There are terrible movies that I don't even want to think about. But as someone who's been doing it for decades, it's impossible to say that one thing stands out more than any others. I did a movie that came out this year, actually. It went straight to DVD. Everyone missed it. But it was a movie that I really loved called Route 30.
Route 30.
Yeah. And it's written and directed by John Putch. And it's got Dana Delaney in it, and Robert Romanos, and David DeLuise, and Kevin Rahm. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. I absolutely love the movie. And it's a very small, sort of rural comedy in 3 parts. And we're actually starting in December. I mean, the movie itself is done in 3 parts, but in addition to that, John Putch is doing 3 movies over the period of the next few years. So this was actually made 2 years ago, came out in January, I think, of this year. Now, in December, we go back to Pennsylvania. That's where it takes place, in south central Pennsylvania. We'll go back in December and shoot the 2nd movie. And then after that movie comes out, then we'll do the 3rd. And they're probably all going to wind up just going to straight to DVD. But Route 30 for me was the most pure enjoyment I've had in a long time. And it isn't even that I'm that crazy about my performance in it, but I love the movie deeply.
Wow. I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
So a second ago, when you were talking about Harry Nilsson, you were mentioning that you had written that letter to him about a biography. Would you ever still consider that?
No. I don't know what I was thinking, really. I mean, I had no business even suggesting such a thing. I write, but I'm not a biographer, and a biographer is, I mean, for someone to do it properly, it's something that really needs to be approached by people who know what they're doing. I had this definite desire, really a passion, over the years to expose as much of Harry's music as possible to people. And at the time, I guess, it seemed like that would be a way of doing it. And even by that time, in '76, he was beginning to his star was beginning, such as it was beginning to fade. And so I thought that, this would be a way of, giving back and at the same time, exposing this music and who he is to people. So that was the way I approached it. But in retrospect, I think about it, and I've got this, I still have this massive, and I did all of these interviews with session people that he worked with for years. I've got all of these taped interviews that I did with Klaus Voormann and Van Dyke Parks and Gary Wright and Chris Spedding and Jane Getz and all these people, that producers that did his albums and all this stuff. I've got this massive archive here, and I don't really have anything to do with it. So I don't know. Eventually I'm going to unload it onto somebody, but I don't know who.
Well, that's actually sounds amazing. Yeah, that sounds incredible. I don't know what to say about that, but yeah, that's probably quite a gold mine there with Klaus Voormann.
Well, if
wow.
It's there for somebody who wants to use it.
Right. Well,
but and in fact, I heard somebody told me the other day that there's somebody in England who's been blogging about the fact that he's writing a book about Harry Nilsson, but I don't know any of the details about that, and I've never no one that I know around here has ever heard from him, so I don't know what his thing is there, but eventually I'll have to get rid of this stuff.
Well, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you, but I have one final question before we go.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Armstrong, what would you like to say to all the people listening in?
Well, thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't boring as hell. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking about things that interest me that don't have that much to do with me. I love talking about books. I love talking about music, and so it was nice to be able to talk about something that interests me.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for all the information. I can assure you it wasn't boring.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Armstrong, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.